At 34,000 feet, peace is just an illusion built on pressurized aluminum and recycled air. Jessica knew the exact sound a turbine makes right before it rips itself apart. When the floor shuddered and the oxygen masks dropped, she didn't scream. She reached for her shoes. Seat 22A was a cage. For a woman used to the expansive glass bubble canopy of an F-35A Lightning II, the window seat of a commercial Boeing 767 felt like a coffin. Major Jessica Ridley leaned her temple against the scratched acrylic window. Outside, the world was a pristine, blinding white expanse of clouds over the American Midwest. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the faint, pervasive odor of recycled breath. She was 36 hours removed from a deployment in Al Dhafra. Her bones ached. Her flight suit was packed away in the cargo hold, replaced by a faded denim jacket and gray sweatpants. She just wanted to go to sleep. She wanted to wake up in Seattle, get in her truck, and drive until the noise of the world faded out. But the man in 22B wouldn't stop talking. His name was Arthur. He wore a rumpled beige cardigan and had the nervous, kinetic energy of a man who firmly believed that if he stopped paying attention to the plane, it would fall out of the sky. He gripped the plastic armrests until his knuckles bruised white. "My daughter's picking me up," Arthur said, his voice vibrating over the dull roar of the twin turbo fans. "She just had her second. A boy, first time I'm seeing him." "That's great, Arthur," Jessica murmured. She didn't look away from the clouds. It was a polite dismissal, the kind you learn to perfect in crowded transit hubs and mandatory military briefings. "You flying home?" he asked, missing the cue entirely. "Something like that." "I don't like flying," Arthur confessed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Too many moving parts. You ever think about how heavy this thing is? It shouldn't stay up. It's just not natural." Jessica finally turned her head. She looked at his pale, sweating face. She felt a brief, cynical flash of amusement. "It's just physics, Arthur. Thrust, lift, drag, weight. The machine doesn't know it's heavy. It just obeys the math." Arthur blinked, clearly not comforted. Before he could formulate a response, the math changed. It didn't sound like an explosion. Movies always get that wrong. It sounded like a massive, hollow steel drum being struck by a freight train, a concussive crack that bypassed the ears and registered directly in the sternum. Instantly, the Boeing yawed violently to the right. Gravity shifted. Loose items, magazines, plastic cups, a woman's purse, became projectiles, slamming against the right side bulkheads. The cabin lights snapped out, plunging them into a gloomy gray twilight. Then came the decompression. The air turned instantly freezing. A thick, white fog materialized out of nowhere as the cabin moisture condensed. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched, rushing shriek of pressurized air escaping into the thin stratosphere. Above them, panels snapped open. Yellow silicone masks dangled like dead spiders on translucent strings. Panic is not a single sound. It is a terrifying choir, screams, prayers, the sickening crunch of metal tearing, and the brutal, mechanical vibration shaking the floorboards. Jessica didn't scream. Her heart rate spiked, but her training instantly hijacked her nervous system. Adrenaline flooded her veins, freezing the world into sharp, hyper-focused fragments. Rapid decompression, uncontained engine failure, She grabbed the yellow cup swinging in front of her face, yanked it sharply to start the chemical oxygen generator, and clamped it over her nose and mouth. She secured the elastic strap. Next to her, Arthur was paralyzed. His eyes were wide, rolling back slightly. He was gasping, pulling at his collar, his hands shaking too violently to reach for his mask. Hypoxia at 34,000 feet gives you about 30 seconds of useful consciousness before your brain simply shuts off. Jessica slammed an elbow into his ribs. Arthur gasped, his eyes snapping to hers. She grabbed his oxygen mask, pulled the lanyard tight, and shoved the plastic cup over his face. She reached behind his head and snapped the elastic band into place, pulling it tight. She patted his cheek, hard. "Breathe!" she shouted through her own mask, though she couldn't even hear her own voice over the roaring wind. She turned back to the window. Seat 22A was directly behind the right wing. She looked out and felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. The number 2 engine was gone. Not malfunctioning. Gone. The massive, sleek titanium cowling was peeled back, like a tin can hit by a shotgun blast. Jagged metal teeth chewed into the aerodynamic leading edge of the wing. Black smoke and raw orange jet fuel fire trailed out behind them, whipping away in the 600-mile-per-hour slipstream. Worse, the wing surface was peppered with shrapnel holes. The ailerons were vibrating violently. Jessica closed her eyes and felt the floor with the soles of her feet. In a fighter jet, you fly with your whole body. You feel the slip, the skid, the angle of attack through the seat of your pants. The Boeing was crabbing heavily. The nose was pitched down at an extreme angle, and they were in a steep right bank. The remaining left engine was desperately trying to push the plane forward, but with the right side producing pure, massive drag. The asymmetrical thrust was twisting the aircraft out of the sky. "They're fighting it," Jessica thought, visualizing the pilots in the cockpit. "They're stomping the left rudder, trying to keep the nose straight. But the hydraulics are sluggish." The shuddering grew worse. The airframe groaned, a deep structural agony. They were losing the fight. The descent was too steep. At this rate, they would tear the wings off before they even hit the ground. Jessica reached down and tightly laced her boots. 10 minutes. It felt like a lifetime, but Jessica's internal clock knew it had only been 10 minutes since the explosion. The initial violent plunge had leveled out, but they were still descending rapidly. They had dropped out of the high stratosphere and breached the lower cloud layers. The shrieking wind had dulled to a heavy, oppressive roar. The oxygen masks were no longer strictly necessary as they crossed below 14,000 feet, but nobody took them off. The cabin was a freezing, terrified tomb. Passengers were huddled in brace positions, weeping quietly. The smell of scorched wiring and hydraulic fluid was suffocating. Jessica sat perfectly still. She was tracking the bank angle. It was sloppy. The plane would roll 10 degrees right, then jerk back to the left, then drop the nose. It was the frantic, over-corrected flying of a crew completely overwhelmed, or fighting a severed control linkage. Then the PA system crackled. The chime was a jarring reminder of normalcy, followed by a voice that was anything but normal. It wasn't the deep, reassuring baritone of a captain. It was a woman's voice, trembling so hard the words were barely decipherable over the static. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the lead flight attendant. We have a critical situation on the flight deck." A ragged intake of breath. if there is a military pilot on board, anyone with military aviation experience, please ring your call button immediately. Please. The cynical part of Jessica's brain, the part built by thousands of hours of combat simulations and debriefings, flashed a warning. You fly single-seat fighters. This is a heavy, multi-engine commercial jet. You don't know the avionics. You don't know the bus systems. You stay in your seat and you brace for impact. But the other part of her brain, the part that looked at Arthur shivering in 22B, clutching a photo of his daughter, overrode the cynicism. A private pilot couldn't fly this. A Cessna pilot would over-G the airframe in 3 seconds. They didn't need someone who knew how to program the autopilot. They needed someone who knew how to wrestle a dead, falling heavy object out of a stall. They needed hands. Jessica reached up and pressed the call button. The little amber light blinked on. Within seconds, a flight attendant appeared in the aisle. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her blue uniform was stained with something dark, and her hands were shaking violently as she gripped the seatbacks to stay upright on the slanted floor. "You?" the girl asked, her voice cracking. "Major Jessica Ridley, United States Air Force," Jessica said, unbuckling her seatbelt. She stood up. The floor was tilted down at a 15-degree angle. "Take me to the front." Walking up the aisle of a dying airplane is an exercise in ignoring ghosts. Hundreds of eyes looked up at her as she passed. Desperate, pleading, terrified eyes. They looked at her calm demeanor, her straight posture, and they saw a savior. Jessica hated it. She didn't have a miracle in her pocket. She just had muscle memory. They reached the forward galley. The cockpit door was already pinned open. Jessica stepped over the threshold and into a nightmare. The noise inside the flight deck was deafening. It was a cacophony of automated alarms. A synthetic, robotic voice was screaming on an endless loop. "Bank angle! Bank angle! Pull up! Pull up!" The master caution light flashed a brilliant, angry red against the gray instrument panels. The windshield on the right side was entirely crazed with spiderweb cracks. In the left seat, the captain was a mess. He was an older man, heavily built, gripping the control yoke with arms that were visibly trembling. His uniform shirt was soaked in sweat. Blood from a gash on his forehead ran down into his right eye, but he couldn't take his hands off the yoke to wipe it away. The right seat, the first officer's seat, was empty. A heavy fire axe was embedded in the bulkhead behind it, having flown forward during the sudden deceleration. The seat itself was covered in blood. "Captain," Jessica said, stepping into the narrow space, raising her voice over the alarms. The man didn't look at her. His eyes were glued to the primary flight display. "Where's the pilot?" he choked out, his voice hoarse. "They said—" "I'm the pilot, Major Ridley, USAF." He finally cut his eyes toward her. He looked at her sweatpants, her denim jacket. He looked like he was about to cry. "I don't have hydraulics," he ground out through clenched teeth, his muscles straining as he held the yoke turned almost completely sideways just to keep the wings level. "Shrapnel cut the A and B systems. I'm on standby pressure, and it's bleeding out. Manual reversion." Jessica's blood ran cold. Manual reversion. In a modern airliner, the controls are fly-by-wire, aided by massive hydraulic actuators. Moving the ailerons on a 300,000-pound aircraft moving at 400 knots against the wind without hydraulics is like trying to steer a semi-truck with a broken steering column while sliding on ice. You are literally pulling cables that move giant metal slabs against hurricane-force winds, using nothing but human muscle. "Where is your FO?" she asked, sliding into the right seat and throwing the 4-point harness over her shoulders. "Head wound. Cabin crew pulled him out. He's unconscious in the forward galley," the captain gasped. "I'm David Miller." "Okay, David, I'm Mac," she said, using her call sign. It grounded her. It brought her back to the flight line. "Talk to me. What do we have?" "Right engine is gone. Dead. Destroyed. Left is at max continuous thrust, but it's pushing us sideways. Drag is massive. We're falling at 2,000 feet a minute. If I let go of this yoke, we roll over and dive." Jessica looked at the altimeter. 9,000 feet. They were dropping like a stone. She looked at the primary flight display. The airspeed was hovering dangerously close to the red tape, the stall speed. They were flying too slow, but if they sped up, the asymmetrical drag would rip the right wing off. "I can't hold it anymore," David said, his voice breaking. His arms were shaking violently. Lactic acid was shutting his muscles down. He had been arm wrestling a Boeing for 15 minutes straight. "I need you to take the yoke. Just hold it straight. Let me run the emergency checklists." Jessica reached out and gripped the first officer's control column. It felt cold, rigid, and vibrating with violent kinetic energy. "I have the controls," Jessica said, the standard aviation handover phrase. "You have the controls," David replied, immediately letting go. The moment his hands left the yoke, a massive, crushing weight transferred into Jessica's arms. The yoke slammed forcefully to the right as the dead wing tried to drag them down. Jessica gritted her teeth, her biceps straining against the fabric of her jacket. She planted her boots hard on the rudder pedals, shoving her left leg forward with every ounce of strength in her lower body to counteract the dead engine. "Jesus!" she hissed, her shoulders screaming in protest. It took all of her physical strength just to hold the plane in a 10-degree bank. It wasn't flying, it was controlled falling. "Airspeed is bleeding off, Mac," David yelled over the alarms. He was frantically flipping through a bulky, spiral-bound QRH, Quick Reference Handbook. "We need to pitch down to gain speed or we stall. If I pitch down, we lose altitude faster. We're at 8,000 feet, Jessica shouted back. She glanced out the shattered right window. Below the clouds, the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Cascade Mountains were looming up to meet them like teeth. They weren't going to make an airport. Jessica tightened her grip on the yoke, her knuckles white. She looked at the altimeters spinning downward, then over at David. The cynicism burned away, replaced by the cold, calculating ice of a combat pilot cornered in a dogfight. "David," she said, her voice dropping into a deadly calm register that cut straight through the blaring alarms. "Put the book away. We aren't going to fix this." David looked up, his face pale. "Find me a piece of flat dirt," Jessica ordered, shoving her left leg harder into the rudder pedal. "Because we're putting this bus on the ground in less than 4 minutes. David didn't argue. The panic in his eyes receded, shoved aside by the blunt, brutal reality of their math. He reached for the center console and switched the navigation display from the weather radar to the terrain awareness overlay. The screen bloomed into a terrifying topographical map. Solid red and yellow jagged blobs filled the display. The Cascade Mountains. They were flying at 8,000 feet, and the granite peaks around them stretched up to 10. They were in a bowl of rock, and the floor was rising. "I have nothing," David said, his voice stripped of emotion, reduced to raw data. "It's all ridges and timber. The nearest runway is Yakima, 40 miles east. We don't have the altitude to clear the pass." "I don't need a runway," Jessica grunted. The muscles in her forearms were burning with a sharp, acidic fire. It felt like she was trying to hold a collapsing concrete ceiling off her chest. She kept her left leg locked out, her boot driving the rudder pedal to the floorboard just to stop the aircraft from twisting into a death spiral. "I need a valley, a riverbed, a frozen lake, anything that isn't a vertical cliff." David's fingers hovered over the glass screen, tracing the contour lines. "Heading 210, 12 miles. There's a valley basin, agricultural land, flat, mostly snow-covered this time of year." "Set the heading bug," Jessica commanded, "and pull the left throttle back." David stared at her. "If I pull the power, we drop faster. If we don't bleed speed, this right wing is going to shear off," Jessica said. The shuddering in the yoke was growing violently erratic. The damaged metal outside was catching the supersonic airflow, twisting the wing spar. "I need you to work the throttle. I can't take my hands off the wheel. When I say push, you give me thrust. When I say pull, you cut it. We're going to steer with the engine." David swallowed hard and wrapped his hand around the single live throttle lever. "Ready? Pull." David pulled the lever back. The deafening roar of the left turbofan spooled down. Immediately, the nose dropped heavily, gravity taking hold of the 300,000-pound dying machine. But the terrible twisting yaw eased just a fraction. They dropped into the thick gray soup of the cloud layer. Flying blind in mountainous terrain with failing controls is a pilot's purest nightmare. The cockpit was entirely gray. The crazed right window let in nothing but a fractured, dull light. The synthetic voice of the ground proximity warning system woke up, recognizing their fatal descent rate. "Sink rate. Pull up." "Ignore it," Jessica said. Her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Sweat stung her eyes, but she couldn't blink it away. "Call my altitude. 6,000, David read off the tape. "Descent rate is 1,800 feet per minute. Terrain. 5,000. We should be breaking out of the ceiling in a few hundred feet." "I need flaps, David. Give me flap 15. We need lift to stretch this glide." "We have no hydraulics," David warned, his hand moving to the flap lever. "If they deploy asymmetrically, we'll roll." "We're dead if we don't. Do it." David threw the lever. Under the floorboards, electric backup motors whined in protest. The heavy aircraft shuddered as the massive metal slabs on the trailing edges of the wings extended into the slipstream. By some miracle of Boeing engineering, they deployed evenly. The nose pitched up slightly, and the descent rate slowed. Then they broke out of the clouds. The world below them was a stark, brutal landscape of white and dark green. Towering pine trees rushed past beneath them, impossibly close. The altimeter read 3,000 feet, but the ground was rising up to meet them. Straight ahead, framed by two steep ridges of jagged rock, lay the valley. It was a wide, flat expanse of snow-covered farmland, crisscrossed by dark lines of split-rail fences and frozen irrigation ditches. "There," David pointed. "I see it," Jessica said. "It's too close. We're coming in too hot. At 400 knots, hitting the dirt wouldn't be a landing. It would be a crater. Drop the gear? David asked, his hand hovering over the heavy lever. No, Jessica snapped. The ground is soft snow and mud. If the wheels dig in, we cartwheel and break apart. We go in on the belly. It'll act like a sled. Too low. Terrain. The robotic voice was screaming now. The ground was terrifyingly close. Jessica could see individual branches on the pine trees. She could see the deep ruts in the snow of the valley floor. Push! Jessica yelled. David shoved the left throttle forward. The engine roared, a desperate surge of thrust trying to carry them over the final ridge. The aircraft yawed violently to the right again. Jessica screamed in sheer physical agony as she hauled the yoke left, her shoulders popping, her biceps cramping into rigid knots. They cleared the ridge by less than 200 feet. The valley floor opened up before them, a flat, blinding white runway of snow and frozen dirt. Cut the power, Jessica screamed. Kill the engine, kill the fuel, pull the fire bottles. I want this plane dead before we hit. David's hands blurred over the center pedestal. He slammed the left thrust lever to idle, grabbed the red fuel cutoff switches, and yanked them down. The engine spooled down into a whining silence. He reached up to the overhead panel and slammed the fire suppression handles. The roaring stopped. Suddenly, the only sound left in the world was the wind screaming past the aluminum hull. It was a terrifying, hollow quiet. Brace, Jessica whispered. David keyed the PA system. Brace for impact. Brace, brace, brace. 200 feet. The snow was rushing up at a dizzying speed. Without engine thrust, the heavy jet was dropping out of the sky. It was no longer flying. It was a brick with wings. Help me, Jessica roared. David grabbed the captain's yoke. Pull back, Jessica commanded. Together, they hauled back on the control columns with every ounce of remaining strength in their bodies. The heavy metal cables, fighting against thousands of pounds of aerodynamic pressure, groaned. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the Boeing pitched up just a few degrees. The flare. It wasn't enough to make it soft, but it was enough to keep the nose from digging into the dirt like a shovel. The tail hit first. The sound was apocalyptic. The aft pressure bulkhead slammed into the frozen earth at 180 miles an hour. The noise bypassed the eardrums entirely and rattled directly in the bones, a catastrophic, metallic tearing that sounded like a shipyard being ripped apart by a hurricane. Then the main fuselage slammed down. Jessica was thrown violently forward, the 4-point harness biting into her collarbones with enough force to bruise muscle. The cockpit windows filled with a blinding spray of snow, mud, and torn topsoil. The deceleration was a physical wall. The G-forces dragged at Jessica's face, pulling the blood to the front of her skull. The aircraft was sliding, the belly grinding over the frozen earth, acting as a massive, abrasive brake. The vibrations were violent enough to blur her vision. Above them, overhead panels broke loose, showering the cockpit with plastic debris and wiring. The master caution alarm was shrieking, completely pointless now. Keep it straight. Keep it straight. Jessica's hands were clamped onto the yoke with a death grip, her boots pinned to the rudder pedals. She was fighting to keep the nose pointed forward. If they turned sideways, the wing would catch. The fuselage would snap in half, and they would tumble. They tore through a wooden fence, exploding the heavy timber into splinters that battered the radome. The speed bled off. 100 knots. 60 knots. The right wing dipped, the ruined engine cowling, catching the dirt. The plane slewed violently to the right, spinning 30 degrees, throwing Jessica against the side of her seat. And then, with a heavy groaning shudder that echoed through the entire length of the metal spine, the Boeing stopped. Silence slammed into the cockpit, heavy and absolute. For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of the wind outside and the frantic, shallow gasping of David's breathing. Jessica didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands were locked onto the yoke in a rigid, tetanic cramp. She stared out the shattered windshield. It was completely obscured by packed white snow and brown earth. She blinked. Dust drifted lazily through the cold air of the flight deck. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers. They were completely numb, locked in the shape of the control column. She let her hands fall into her lap. Every muscle in her upper body felt like it had been beaten with a tire iron. She turned her head. David was slumped against his harness. He was breathing, his eyes wide and fixed on the center console. Blood was still dripping from his forehead, pooling on the collar of his ruined shirt. "David," Jessica croaked. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. He blinked, slowly turning his head to look at her. "We're on the ground." "Yeah," Jessica said. She reached up and unbuckled her harness. Her hands were shaking violently now. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by a deep, hollow shock. "Let's see who's still with us." She stood up. Her legs wobbled, but they held. She stepped backward out of the flight deck and looked down the length of the forward galley. The cabin door was crumpled, the emergency slide already popping, hissing as it inflated into the freezing air. Beyond it, the main cabin was a scene of utter destruction. Oxygen masks swung wildly. Overhead bins had collapsed, spilling luggage across the aisles. The floor was canted at an awkward angle. But there was movement. People were unbuckling. They were coughing in the dust, crying, calling out names. The flight attendants were already moving, shouting evacuation commands, their voices remarkably steady in the chaos. Jessica walked slowly down the aisle, her boots crunching over broken plastic and scattered magazines. She moved like a ghost through the wreckage. Passengers pushed past her, heading for the overwing exits, their faces pale masks of shock. She let them pass. She reached row 22. The window was cracked, letting in a bitter, freezing wind. The wall paneling was bowed inward. Arthur was still in 22B. He was pinned under a heavy hardshell suitcase that had fallen from the bin above. He was staring straight ahead, his chest heaving. His hands were gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles were bleeding. Jessica stopped. She reached down, grabbed the handle of the suitcase, and hauled it off him, throwing it into the empty aisle. Arthur gasped, his head snapping toward her. He looked at her gray sweatpants. He looked at her denim jacket, now covered in hydraulic fluid and cockpit dust. He looked at her face, pale and exhausted, the cynical edge completely burned away. "You flying home?" Jessica asked, her voice quiet. Arthur stared at her. Slowly, the terror in his eyes broke, replaced by the crushing realization that he was alive. He looked down at his shaking hands, then reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out the wrinkled, slightly torn photograph of a newborn baby. Tears finally spilled over his eyelids, cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "Yeah," Arthur choked out, his voice cracking. "Yeah, I'm flying home." Jessica nodded. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't smile. She just reached out, gripped his shoulder with a bruised, shaking hand, and squeezed. "Good," she said. "Go meet your grandson." She stepped aside, letting him stumble into the aisle. Jessica leaned back against the bulkhead, closed her eyes, and finally, for the first time in 36 hours, allowed herself to rest. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let us know. Aviation survival stories show us the absolute limit of human endurance and skill under pressure. Want more deeply human, adrenaline-pumping stories like this one? Hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. How would you react if you were sitting in seat 22B? Share this video with a friend who hates flying, and we'll see you in the next one.